Hello everyone, I'm Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. Halloween is, of course, a time to celebrate the dark side of life, but it's also a meditation on death, in a strange way. We surround ourselves with memento mori like skulls and coffins, constant reminders of death transformed into things of entertainment. The dead visit the living much more frequently this time of year. The Phantasm movies are perfect for this time of year, and not just because of their strange atmosphere and haunting score. In spite of their flaws, the Phantasm films are a perfect illustration of how people personify, face, and cope with their own mortality. The Tall Man is this franchise's Grim Reaper, and our heroes are forced to find new ways to think about their lives as he collects the ones they love. Be warned, there will be spoilers for all the films in the franchise. I recommend watching all of them before you watch this whole video. In the original Phantasm, we are instantly put in a morbid state of mind as we see Tommy killed by the Lady in Lavender while having sex with him in the cemetery. This brings a couple important elements that carry through the franchise into play. First is the idea that death takes on endless forms depending on who you are. The Lady in Lavender is one of the Tall Man's many shapes, and the one he uses to seduce both Tommy and Jody. This demonstrates that the Tall Man doesn't adhere to things like gender, just as personifications of death in culture come in all shapes and sizes. The amorphous nature of the Tall Man and death is also shown when the Tall Man's dismembered finger turns into a bizarre creature and attacks the protagonists. The opening scene also introduces the beautiful places of death that make up the setting of the Phantasm movies. A good portion of the scenes in Phantasm and its sequels are set in a cemetery, crypt, a mortuary, or inside a hearse. These settings are a constant reminder of death's presence. They are also, more often than not, places of operation for the Tall Man and his henchmen, the physical embodiment of this omnipresent death. These henchmen take the form of tiny hooded creatures reminiscent of the Jawas in Star Wars, dubbed Lurkers in Phantasm 3. They are created by compressing the corpses of people taken by the Tall Man into a dwarfed form. This is necessary for them to serve as slaves on the Tall Man's planet because of the gravity and heat there. A half-baked explanation if ever there was one, but it makes for a hellish vision of the afterlife. This means that the protagonists are being pursued by a literal demonization of loss, their loved ones transformed into tiny, impish Grim Reapers. This sense of loss permeates every aspect of Phantasm, including the music. The score itself consists of a music box-like theme taken into sinister territory by swells of synthesizer, pipe organ sounds, and a ghostly-sounding choir. The combination of instruments perfectly captures the feeling of a child's life under the shadow of death. Even Sittin' Here at Midnight, the laid-back song performed by Reggie and Jody on Jody's front porch, is about loss to some extent. While the lyrics aren't necessarily about death, they are about losing someone you care about, and blues songs are inherently sad on some level. Our main character, Mike, is offered two ways to look at his situation in the film. The first is given when he visits the fortune teller near the beginning of the film and tells her about his fears, both of the Tall Man and of losing his brother. She conjures up a box, which he is told to put his hand inside. He cries out in pain, but the response from the fortune teller's daughter is, "Don't fear. Fear is the killer." He's told the pain is all in his head and will go away if he doesn't fear. "Don't fear" is a mantra he repeats to himself throughout the film. After the Tall Man is seemingly defeated, Mike wakes up in his own bed. He is told by Reggie that his brother Jody died in a car accident, and the Tall Man was just a dream. This leads to Mike starting to cry, as he says he knows the Tall Man is still out there. Reggie tells Mike, "I know you're scared, but you're not alone." This is the second way of looking at the situation, which I prefer. Don't fear doesn't ever help anyone in the Phantasm movies. Fear of death is natural, so is pain, but you don't have to face those things alone. Even though Phantasm ends on a sinister note, with the Tall Man claiming Mike, this message continues through the films, with the characters bonding together to cope with the loss of their loved ones and face down death itself, or himself, or herself. In Phantasm 2, it is revealed that Mike was rescued from the Tall Man by Reggie and has been institutionalized for 7 years. He leaves and reunites with Reggie. The film continues Mike's journey of facing the Tall Man, but some focus is shifted to Reggie and new character Liz, who have both experienced a horrible loss that connects them to the tall man. Reggie loses his entire family in an explosion in his house caused by the tall man. This makes it possible for Reggie to follow Mike along his dark path, but his loss and pain is only barely touched upon, lessening its horrific impact to leave more room for crazy action sequences. Much more focus is given to Liz, who has a psychic bond with Mike. She is dealing with the recent death of her grandfather and the death of both her parents. This allows her to bond with Mike and share his pain. This film also dives into even more morbid imagery, with the creation of lurkers depicted as a nightmare version of the embalming process. The film ends similarly to the original Phantasm, with the tall man claiming the main characters after they had supposedly defeated him. In Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead, it is revealed that Mike and Reggie survived the attack at the end of Phantasm 2, but Liz did not. Mike, after spending 2 years in a coma in the hospital, reunites with Reggie, but is captured by the tall man shortly thereafter. This film follows Reggie's journey to find Mike, as well as the stories of 2 new characters, Tim and Rocky. Tim is a young boy whose entire family has been taken by the tall man. He's a much more hardened character than Mike was in the original film, but he's also been completely alone where Mike had Jody and Reggie. He clings to Reggie, similar to how Mike clinged to Jody in Phantasm. Rocky doesn't get as much development as Tim. She loses her friend to one of the tall man's deadly spheres, which I've neglected to mention until now. She's less interested in being a part of a group with the other protagonists, and it seems her main motivation is to avenge her friend's death. While Rocky's snark and sarcasm make her likable, she's also written in a way that feels unfortunately flat and stereotypical. And I did not ask for those scenes between her and Reggie. In this installment, the tall man has started wiping out entire towns, which brings new scope to his character as a personification of death and loss. He's not an intimate, personal reaper anymore. He's the embodiment of a plague. Phantasm 3 also adds an interesting dimension to the spheres I've been ignoring. The late Jody appears to Mike and Reggie in the form of a rogue sphere, and it's revealed that the minds of the people who have been turned into lurkers have been put inside the spheres. This makes another one of the chief obstacles to the protagonists into another manifestation of their loss. The end of Phantasm 3 is similar to that of the last 2 films, except that Mike is left on his own to face his demons after having some bizarre surgery done on him by the tall man. Reggie is pinned to the wall by dozens of spheres, the tall man reappears, and Tim is dragged through the window by the lurkers as Mike is in the original. In Phantasm 4, Oblivion, Reggie is inexplicably released from the swarm of spheres by the tall man. Reggie at first tries to break away from the strange life he's found himself stuck in, but after a gruesome encounter with an undead cop, he continues the search for Mike. This film is a departure from the formula of the last 2, as new characters are all but eliminated entirely, and the focus is put back on the original film's trio of Mike, Reggie, and Jody, with a heavy focus on Mike. Phantasm 4 even incorporates unused scenes shot for the original film. Throughout this film, Mike is becoming more and more like the tall man because of the connection surgically implanted in his head. He gains telepathic powers, and Reggie has a vision of Mike wearing the tall man's suit. My interpretation of this is that Mike is so close to death's door, or dimension gate if you will, that he starts taking on attributes of death itself. It is revealed that the form we see the tall man in is the body of Jebediah Morningside, a scientifically curious undertaker who built his own dimension gate and never came back. While this undercuts the mystery of the tall man character to some extent, I like the idea that the tall man has infinite forms. He just likes appearing as an imposing old undertaker the most. It gets across the point that he is death. It's not unlike how It, in the Stephen King story, has infinite forms. It just likes appearing as Pennywise the Clown the most. At the end of this film, the tall man is blown up, but reappears through a portal to rip out the sphere he implanted in Mike's head, then leaves. Mike tells Reggie he is dying, Reggie promises not to let Mike die, then goes through the Dimension Gate to continue pursuing the Tall Man. In Phantasm Ravager, Reggie continues the journey he was on in the last movie, but then wakes up in a wheelchair, extremely old. He is being pushed by Mike, who tells him he's been diagnosed with dementia. This movie does a role reversal of Mike and Reggie, with Mike now being the one looking out for Reggie, and Reggie uncertain if he has dementia or if the Tall Man is messing with his mind. Mike doesn't seem to remember anything about the Tall Man, and says Reggie is the one who helped him through Jodie's death, nothing more. Just as Mike had to come to terms with Jodie's death, now Reggie has to come to terms with his own impending death. The film constantly switches between Reggie in a post-apocalyptic world ravaged by the Tall Man, and Reggie inside the hospital in the so-called normal world. At the end of the film, Reggie, Mike, and Jodie all drive off in the post-apocalyptic world to continue fighting the Tall Man. Simultaneously, Reggie passes away in a hospital bed with Mike and Jodie, who is inexplicably alive again, by his side. Regardless of what the viewer chooses to believe is the reality, both endings share the same message. Death is a constant reality that comes for us all, and the best way to cope with it is to stick together. None of the Phantasm movies are perfect. They all have strange plot holes, the way the characters interact feels unnatural sometimes, and there's a perverse element to the protagonists that rubs me the wrong way. But they're all entertaining films with something to say, and there's a handmade charm to them that I appreciate. The original film in particular has a surreal and macabre atmosphere that's only topped by the likes of Suspiria, and is perfect for Halloween. Given the very real horrors we're surrounded with now, it might be good to confront the specter of death in the form of an imposing alien undertaker. Happy Halloween, and remember, we're all scared, but we're not alone. Now, if you'll excuse me, the funeral is about to begin.